Folks, one of the jobs of a philosopher is to analyze language. I mean, is job really the right word? Is it language or is it ideas? It's really both. Is there a distinction between the two? Sorry. Anyway, so I want to do some videos on this channel where I just sort of go through something in some detail, something someone said or wrote, and just kind of go through it from a philosopher's lens, which won't always be the most useful lens, but, you know, it's different and interesting, maybe. You may have heard that the company known as Palantir, hopefully you've heard of Palantir. It's a very interesting company. It's a company which has taken a truly novel approach to public relations, where it's sort of openly presented itself proudly, you might say, as a company whose aims are what many people would consider as evil, and they don't really try to hide it. So recently they published this manifesto for the company, and I should back up. So Palantir is a company. They mostly do sort of, I guess, AI-based surveillance, a lot of data collection, surveillance. It's used for immigration enforcement, things like that. People have called them techno-fascist, and sort of openly, it's not me, guys. I'm just saying what people say. But anyways, they put out this manifesto, which is based on a book that the CEO, Alex Karp, published last year. So it's a 22 sort of point manifesto describing the goals of the company, I guess. And again, I thought it would be kind of interesting to go through them. There was an article on The Guardian which talks about this manifesto. Palantir manifesto described as ramblings of a supervillain. This was by a UK member of parliament who said this. So again, it's, I'm not saying anything particularly new here when I say they have an interesting approach to PR, again, as you'll see. And so the book that this manifesto is based on is called The Technological Republic. Now, I assume that this is an allusion to Plato's book, The Republic, an early work of political philosophy, which frankly is not very popular among political philosophers. He describes a system where sort of everyone from very early on in life has a very particular role, and each person is sort of trained for that particular role. And famously, it's headed by a philosopher king, because obviously you would want a philosopher to be the king. Anyways, maybe if you're a philosopher writing that kind of book, then you might think that. So anyways, I wanted to start with the book. If you go on Amazon, you'll see this. So it's groundbreaking, iconoclastic new book. But it's worth looking really quickly at some of the commentary. A stirring manifesto for a new Manhattan project for a new age. So if you go down to the reviews, you see no less ambitious than a new treatise in political theory from the Wall Street Journal. Now, I do just want to say, like, treatises are rare, so that's kind of cool. Like, this is, classic treatise here, David Hume, Treatise of Human Nature. You don't get a lot of treatises these days, so, that's exciting. You go down to the Financial Times. Fascinating, if at times disturbing. Okay. One other thing that's striking here is you have the Times of London pointing out that this is the AI manifesto inspiring Keir Starmer's government. That's been the subject of some controversy in UK politics. I don't have all the details, but the Times of London is just saying, hey, it's inspiring the Labour Party, which is ostensibly meant to be a left-leaning political party. And then there's a lot of these comments about how the author is a true patriot and so on. And, again, you'll understand where these comments are coming from. Now, I have not read this book. I don't really intend to read this book unless for some reason there's a lot of overwhelming popular demand. I do like to read things that are novel. So, you never know, but I do just want to make a disclaimer that I have not read the book. So I'm just going off of the bullet points. Maybe some of the things in there that are confusing, the bullet points are made more clear in the book. Okay, so let's get to this manifesto. And it's posted on X also. Sorry, something just happened with my camera. I might have completely changed the colors, but this is This is a Philosopher-run channel. I don't know what you expect exactly. Let me try to do this in a way where we don't see all of it at once. So, again, 22 bullet points. We'll go through it bit by bit. So, again, this manifesto is meant to be a summary of the book, The Technological Republic. So let's see what we got. Okay. Bullet point number 1. Silicon Valley owes a moral debt to the country that made its rise possible. Okay, that's nice. I mean, this is something that, progressive types have long sort of complained about, the fact that industry and business often ignores the important role of government and public funding and, for example, university research on innovation, which people get to make use of for free. So, maybe that's where this is going. The engineering elite of Silicon Valley has an affirmative obligation to participate in the defense of a nation. Okay, interesting. So not what I expected. I thought maybe for a second it would be something like Silicon Valley recognizes its obligation to pay taxes. Then you see something like this. Palantir pays 0 federal income tax, I think, for the past 3 years or something, despite explosive growth. Okay, so it's not that. So it's about defense. Now, for people who know what Palantir is, this is not at all surprising because they're very much involved in trying to sell, develop, and employ AI technology in warfare. And there's going to be a lot of that throughout this manifesto. So, okay, they're interested in national defense, and they think that Silicon Valley sort of has an obligation to participate in that. Now, this is already interesting. Again, if you compare the kind of standard neoliberal Milton Friedman line, his paper is called "The Only Obligation of Business is to Maximize Profits." Right? So this is an extra sort of patriotic obligation that Karp or Palantir thinks that Silicon Valley has. Okay, number 2, we must rebel against the tyranny of apps. Okay, I think we can all relate to that. Maybe there's concern about them being addictive and crappy. Maybe there's something like that going on. Is iPhone our greatest creative, if not crowning achievement as a civilization? The object has changed our lives, but it may also now be limiting and constraining our sense of the possible. Okay, I mean, that's interesting. I think even David Graeber might be amenable to a criticism like that. He argued in the early 2000s that sort of capitalism has stopped really innovating or creating, really life-changing technologies, except for technologies that can be used for surveillance, mass surveillance, which the iPhone also kind of is. And this company is all about. So sort of an uncomfortable convergence. Okay, interesting. Silicon Valley should be more innovative and creative. Fine. Free email is not enough. True. Free email is not enough. The decadence of a culture or civilization, and indeed its ruling class, will be forgiven only if that culture is capable of delivering economic growth and security for the public. That is an interesting thing to say. The decadence. So there's this concern that decadence will not be forgiven. By whom? Probably the people involved in the culture or civilization, or is it by future historians, maybe? I don't know. Probably the people. The decadence of a culture or civilization, and indeed its ruling class. You might think the decadence is primarily about the ruling class. Well, maybe you make the case it's culture or civilization as a whole. And it'll be forgiven only if the culture is capable of delivering economic growth. Not that it does. He probably means to say that it actually does deliver economic growth and security for the public. Okay, interesting. So there's this sort of contrast between decadence and are you actually improving things for people? So concern that the decadence won't be forgiven. Okay, the limits of soft power, of soaring rhetoric alone, have been exposed. The ability of free and democratic societies to prevail requires something more than moral appeal. It requires hard power, and hard power in this century will be built on software. So this is sort of gets to the crux of what Palantir is about. War. War. That's hard power, right? That is military power. A return of ruling by force, or not ruling, let's say, dominating the globe, if you will, by military force. Now, one thing that's awfully misleading here, the limits of soft power, of soaring rhetoric alone. Soft power is not merely soaring rhetoric. I mean, soft power is a very expansive idea, which involves sort of like cultural influence. I imagine trade relations, all kinds of foreign policy things, basically everything else that isn't military power. So this is awfully misleading. It's a strange take on what soft power is. I mean, you might still think that that's not enough. The ability of free and democratic societies to prevail against what exactly? Against like we should stop here and be like, okay, well, what are the primary threats to democratic societies? And again, this is something that will come up over and over. Is it some outside military force? Maybe. I wouldn't think so, but I'm not a geopolitics guy. You might think it's more like tyrannical governments and like misinformation, which military power is not only not useful for dealing with, but is quite the opposite, I would say. Okay, and then the last part. So we need hard power, and hard power will be built on software. It's a fun little contrast between the hard and the soft there. Not terribly surprising. This manifesto, it's not like a sales pitch, but there are elements of that, right? This is a guy or a group that runs this kind of, AI tech company. They think it's really important, and they think it's, a really major player in changing the world in some way or other. And I guess, right, the point is this is where Silicon Valley comes in, because Silicon Valley is all about software. So Silicon Valley needs to contribute to this effort, to contribute to hard power by the development of the appropriate software. Okay, moving on to number 5. The question is not whether AI weapons will be built. It is who will build them and for what purpose. Our adversaries will not pause to indulge in theatrical debates about the merits of developing technologies with critical military and national security applications. They will proceed. They will proceed. All right, I mean, this is a classic sales pitch, right? I imagine this has worked thousands of times for people selling weapons, various technologies to government when it comes to military stuff. Well, look, if you guys don't do it, someone else will. Or they will no matter what, so you have to keep up. Oh my God. You're right. You're so right. Now, I don't know enough about the relevant warfare. I don't know if AI weapons are better or worse. Built into this is the idea that these are really powerful military technologies that will give whoever pays for them a competitive advantage. Okay, so we're really worried about external threats that will utilize these powerful AI technologies. Now here comes a surprise, I think, for a lot of people. National service should be a universal duty. We should, as a society, seriously consider moving away from an all-volunteer force and only fight the next war if everyone shares in the risk and the cost. So, for example, this might involve reinstating the draft, which, for people, for the older generations at this point, I mean, this is a really terrifying kind of policy that, a lot of older people now have experience with from the Vietnam War. And for people growing up in my generation and later, I think we're all incredibly thankful that there was never anything like a draft. Now, I will say there are people who argue that, there are pros and cons to having a draft or not having a draft. And if you don't have a draft, if you have an all-volunteer military, and you have, so in the U.S. now, right, it's sort of the military is used as a socioeconomic ladder, right, a pathway to education and career advancement. So, the military recruits people who don't have lots of opportunities otherwise. in a way that you might think is predatory. But one of the things that not having a draft does is it makes it much easier to sell a war to the public, right? Because for most people in the US, and there's some war in the Middle East, it's on the other side of the world. It doesn't directly affect them. Maybe they'll complain about gas prices or something. But if your child is being shipped off to the front lines, well, that's an entirely different story. And you can imagine there'd be a lot more pushback. Now, as I understand it, people in the U.S. military after Vietnam have no interest in a draft because they don't want to deal with the problems of sort of forcing people into military service. It's just not worth it. In any case, so that's interesting. It's part of the hard power. Now, what's interesting too is like they say that national service should be a universal duty, but the last part almost suggests that it almost makes the point I was making about having a draft, namely that you should only fight a war if everyone shares in the risk and the cost, which kind of makes it sound like, well, you'll be much less likely to fight unnecessary wars if national service is a universal duty, which is just surprising because the rest of this is about how we need to gear up for war. So I'm not entirely sure where they're going with that. 7. If a U.S. Marine asks for a better rifle, we should build it, and the same goes for software. We should, as a country, be capable of continuing a debate about the appropriateness of military action abroad while remaining unflinching in our commitment to those we have asked to step in harm's way. If I'm being an annoying philosopher, the way it's framed is kind of funny. Basically, if a Marine asks for anything, we should give it to them. That's a strange thing to say. But I guess the sentiment is like, look, if you're sending these people off or making a sacrifice to fight in some war, then you need to give them the tools to do the job as well as possible. Now, of course, from a moral standpoint, it very much depends on what the job is. And it's not always clear that just allowing the job to be done as well as possible is a good thing. But so be it. Okay. Public servants need not be our priests. Any business that compensated its employees in the way that the federal government compensates public servants would struggle to survive. I'm going to be honest with you. I have no idea what this is trying to say. I have some ideas. I don't know what to do with the priests thing. So, like, priests get a decent pay. They kind of get their own... Well, I'm thinking in the Catholic context anyways, is the one I'm most familiar with. They get, like, their own dwellings and stuff. I think they do all right. So I don't know if the complaint is that they're paid too much or too little. I would expect Silicon Valley to have a kind of hostile attitude towards government employees and complain about inefficiencies and them being paid too much. On the other hand, you also get arguments in business that, well, if you want the best talent, you have to pay people well. And this is why we need to pay CEOs gazillions of dollars, even though that argument doesn't really work for them, but that's a different question. Also, notice the analogy here. Government pays its employees in such a way that if businesses do it, they would struggle to survive, the businesses. Okay. And it's not a business. Oh, it should be. Oh, okay. Well, that's a different thing. And of course, this is a really common belief for Americans now. Everything should be run like a business. Why? Neoliberal ideology, basically. Okay. Interesting. Number 9. We should show far more grace towards those who have subjected themselves to public life. The eradication of any space for forgiveness, a jettisoning of any tolerance for the complexities and contradictions of the human psyche may leave us with a cast of characters at the helm we will grow to regret. Okay. So for people who are politicians, basically, I assume this is what's meant by public life? Or maybe we just mean celebrities? People who have dedicated themselves to some public cause? And we should be more forgiving. We should have more tolerance for the complexities and contradictions of the human psyche. Look, I mean, That's fair. I think sometimes we're very unfair to people. And if we don't do that, it may leave us with a cast of characters at the helm we will grow to regret. So here we're talking about political leadership. So if we're too critical of people, if we're too critical of politicians, and we don't forgive the ones who make mistakes, then we're going to get bad politicians. You might think that the opposite would be true, that if you're not critical enough, then your standards are low. Maybe the idea is something like, it's so difficult, it's so personally risky to engage in politics that most people are going to be turned off by that, including people who would be best for the job. So you just get crazy people who don't care what people say about them. Maybe something like that. The psychologization. Reading that word, it didn't strike me as being odd, but when you say psychologization, that's a mouthful, of modern politics is leading us astray. Those who look to the political arena to nourish their soul and sense of self, who rely too heavily on their internal life finding expression in people they may never meet, will be left disappointed. So we go from concerns about national security and defense and military stuff and now we're worried about the fact that some people will feel disappointment. Okay, that's interesting. It's leading us astray. It doesn't really say how or why, just that there's disappointment. Those who look to the political arena to nourish their soul. That part sounds like it's talking about like, hey, you're never going to be fulfilled by engaging in politics. Now, maybe that's not what's meant, but if that is what's meant, that seems actually completely the opposite. A lot of times people feel really a sense of meaning and purpose when they actually engage in some kind of action, some kind of community action. And that actually does give them a sense of, it does nourish the soul, let's say. I don't know what to make of the sense of self. But then this is equated with relying too heavily on their internal life finding expression in people they may never meet. So this is about like caring too much about celebrities and including politicians, and you're going to be disappointed if you care too much about celebrities. True. I don't really get the significance of that, but okay. This one really surprised me, I have to say. Our society has grown too eager to hasten and is often gleeful at the demise of its enemies. The vanquishing of an opponent is a moment to pause, not rejoice. I mean, I think I agree with that. It's a very surprising thing to see in a manifesto, which again is sort of stirring up the need for militarization and surveillance. But I mean, fair enough. I think it is a fair point to say that. It's very easy if you're at war with some nation, and in many cases Americans literally will have no idea why, but that winning is good. And so is a cause of rejoice. It is funny to say that. I think lots of people would say like, vanquishing the enemies is like, what better cause for celebration could there be? But no, this is a moment to pause. To pause and do what? It doesn't really, maybe the book has more to say about it. I don't know. The atomic age is ending. One age of deterrence, the atomic age, is ending, and a new era of deterrence built on AI is set to begin. Okay. I mean, maybe there will be additional deterrence, but I'm pretty sure nuclear weapons still serve as a really powerful deterrent. In fact, we see this in discussions about Iran. There's always this lingering concern about the use of nuclear weapons. I don't see how adding AI warfare would change that. Oh, maybe. Well, okay. This is maybe a reach. When you're talking about nuclear weapons, of course, you're talking about international deterrence. One way to think about this one is about domestic deterrence of crime, let's say, through AI surveillance. I don't think that's what's meant here. I assume it's talking about an international thing, but it is sort of confusing. Now for some self-congratulation. No other country in the history of the world has advanced progressive values more than this one. The United States is far from perfect, but it's easy to forget how much more opportunity exists in this country for those who are not hereditary elites than in any other nation on the planet. Progressive values. Okay, so we're into progressive values. That's a little bit surprising too. It's not perfect, but more opportunity exists here. So it's about getting rid of a hereditary elite. Now, I got bad news for you. If you look at the statistics on economic mobility, the U.S. does not do pretty well, right? So the idea of the American dream is, it's a nice idea, and of course it is possible to, go from the bottom to the top. But if you look at the statistics on the likelihood that someone from the bottom quintile makes it to the top quintile versus someone who starts in the top quintile, they're pretty likely to make it to the top quintile. If you start in the bottom quintile, it's very difficult to make it to the top. It's very unusual. It's also, if you start at the top, very unusual that you fall out of that. It very much matters how much money your parents have. And so for people who are interested in equality of opportunity, this is one of the things, economic mobility is one of the things that they care about. And it's just not true that the U.S. is the best in respect. In fact, it's not particularly close. I think the U.S. and the U.K. among OECD countries are among the worst in this respect. Better than lots of places in the world, but certainly not the best. But also interesting that, advancing progressive values is just about it's cashed out purely in terms of economic mobility, not in terms of gender or race equality. Just noteworthy that they choose that. Okay, more self-congratulation. American power has made possible an extraordinarily long peace. Too many have forgotten or perhaps take for granted that nearly a century of some version of peace has prevailed in the world without a great power military conflict. At least 3 generations, billions of people and their children, and now grandchildren, have never known a world war. And this is caused by American power on this view. What about the nuclear deterrent? I thought that could have been an explanation. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is a thing you could say. I suspect lots of historians and people in geopolitics would disagree. Maybe many of them would agree. I will just note here that, while there hasn't been a traditional, I don't know if traditional is the word, but a world war, this is cold comfort to, lots of places in the world. It's not like there is any shortage of war. If you're an American, like throughout my lifetime, what are the periods where there wasn't some war that the U.S. was involved in? And that's just talking about the wars that the U.S. is involved in. There are places in the world where peace has not often been a thing. So it's certainly a privilege for the American people that they have not had to deal with war in their homeland. But it feels a little bit disingenuous to just label that peace as if, this is a kind of global thing. But okay, so this is sort of more patriotic history. Fantastic. Okay, now something very specific. The post-war neutering of Germany and Japan must be undone. The defanging of Germany was an overcorrection for which Europe is now paying a heavy price. A similar and highly theatrical commitment to Japanese pacifism will, if maintained, also threaten to shift the balance of power in Asia. So now we're just talking geopolitics, and we're talking about, what is sort of a popular phrase now, spheres of power, and we're concerned about, presumably in the Japanese case, we're talking about concern about the power of China and Asia, and I assume for Germany we're talking about concerns about Russia, and thinking of these as sort of the big threats to the U.S. And one thing that's interesting throughout all of this is what is with the exception of number 13, where we're talking about progressive values, what is the sort of ultimate moral goal in all this? What is it taking for granted that is the thing that matters most? It's U.S. nationalism, right? They're just saying, it's important that the U.S. continue to dominate the world. And it will do this through our AI surveillance and military products. Yeah, I mean, this is just sort of saying that, right? You might naively be like, well, isn't pacifism good? And shouldn't every country have its own autonomy? Shouldn't countries not dominate other ones? No, I mean, that would be a standpoint you might adopt when you're doing moral theory, but here, that is not the case. We should applaud those who attempt to build where the market has failed to act. The culture almost snickers at Musk's interest in grand narrative, as if billionaires ought to simply stay in their lane of enriching themselves. I'm sorry, were they doing something else? Were they doing anything other than staying in their lane and enriching themselves? Or maybe occupying all the lanes while enriching themselves. Maybe that is what they're doing. Any curiosity or genuine interest in the value of what he has created is essentially dismissed, or perhaps lurks from beneath a thinly veiled scorn. I don't think the thing that people dislike about Elon Musk is that he has curiosity or interests. In fact, when he started up SpaceX and he would do those sort of TED Talk style presentations and people thought he was like an engineer, I think he was pretty well liked. I think it kind of became, it was a different thing when he started openly interfering in political outcomes in various ways. And then also, you know, the Doge stuff, that wasn't very cool. And then also just listening to the things that he says that are not about these interests, let's just say. And it turns out he was a pretty unlikable figure. And also, I don't know what he's doing other than enriching himself. I mean, okay, maybe he's not just doing that. It's his grand plans for space travel and so on, which I find sort of ridiculous, but not everyone agrees. But, you know, always sure to secure record-breaking compensation packages for his role at Tesla and so on. There's a lot of things I could say about that. Actually, my view here is that it's important to snicker and sneer and make fun of people who are narcissists, or really who have... I would go further. I actually think it's healthy to engage in some kind of ridiculing of almost anyone in power, in part for their own sake. Too easy to lose your mind. It's important to be sort of brought back down to earth a bit. But that's my own view. Okay, let's move on though. We're getting there. I'm getting through this. I'm starting to fade. This is exhausting. Silicon Valley must play a role in addressing violent crime. Here now we're getting to the sort of domestic part. Many politicians across the United States have essentially shrugged when it comes to violent crime, abandoning any serious efforts to address the problem or take on any risk with their constituencies or donors, and coming up with solutions and experiments in what should be a desperate bid to save lives. So here's the thing. Okay, so first of all, it's always remarkable to me how, you could get anyone to think that violent crime is getting out of control. When in fact, if you look at the statistics, like in the US, it's dropped very substantially and steadily. And it's been, I think, sort of steady in the last 10 years. But since the 80s and 90s where there was a peak, it's come way down. There's no spike in violent crime. But I will also just say, you get the impression that they think it's a goal to stop all murders, for example. Well, if you wanted to have no murders, how would you do that? Well, you could live in a police state. You could have everyone live in a cell where they're surveilled at all times, and if they do anything that they're not allowed to do, I don't know, maybe they get a shock or something. But this is what we're talking about. My point is, there's always just a trade-off. That one of the consequences of liberty, of having some freedom, is that bad things are going to happen, right? Now, of course, there are things that you can and should do to mitigate those risks, but there's ways to do it that don't violate people's rights or involve surveillance and a complete disregard for privacy, for example. So for instance, I don't know, if if the government takes away all of the food, you're probably going to get an increase in murders, or just introduces scarcity. That's something that's probably going to lead to more violent crime. Actually, one of the things, fun fact for you, it's one of the things that correlates with higher violent crime? Higher temperatures. So, if you care about reducing crime, you should really care about climate change. One of the less talked about consequences is that you can expect at least some factors, some forces which would increase the rates of violent crime. Or, provide education, housing, healthcare. Will that get rid of all the murders? No, but that's just an example of a way that you can mitigate crime without engaging in AI surveillance. Anyways, okay, now we're back to public figures. The ruthless exposure of the private lives of public figures drives far too much talent away from government service. Okay, so maybe this answers one of the mysteries from one of the earlier points, and we're worried about attracting good talent to public service. The public arena and the shallow and petty assaults against those who dare to do something other than enrich themselves. Look, I'm with you on we shouldn't, the point of public life or even life shouldn't be to enrich yourselves. I'm with you there. Anyways, it's become so unforgiving that the Republic is left with a significant roster of ineffectual, empty vessels whose ambition one would forgive if there were any genuine belief structure lurking within. Okay, I agree. You just have sort of empty, narcissistic psychopath types. It's sort of the prototype, at least very high-level politician at this point. But you think the cause of that is that we're too hard on people, or too much of people's private life gets exposed. I could see that as being a deterrent, for sure. I certainly wouldn't want that level of scrutiny. Not really interested in that. So the complaint, though, is that there's really no political ideology, and I don't use that in a pejorative sense. I just no political philosophy under it. There's a couple of exceptions. There's a couple of libertarians, for example. Other than that, what do we expect? We expect that people largely do the bidding of what we call the donors, the people who pay for campaigns, which predicts winning campaigns. And there's lots of research on, in general, wealthy people have much higher engagement with political representatives and political matters than most people. So it sets up a pretty perfect situation for opportunists and people who have no principles whatsoever because will do whatever they're told. I mean, I would suspect that campaign finance is a bigger issue than the exposure of private lives. But look, I'm all for it. Again, I'd rather politicians be treated like public servants rather than celebrities. I agree with that much, at least. The caution in public life that we unwittingly encourage is corrosive. Those who say nothing wrong often say nothing much at all. I mean, that's good advice for a content creator. You can't be too worried about people telling you you're saying something wrong because that's going to happen no matter what. The caution that we unwittingly encourage. We unwittingly encourage it because we fact check. Is that the concern? By trying to figure out whether what people say is true or not. We're unwittingly encouraging too much caution, encouraging people to say nothing at all. I don't really get this. I mean, maybe he's saying, I'm writing this manifesto, which is gonna, as the Financial Times is gonna find disturbing at times. And look, you guys are saying I'm out there, but I think we should not be afraid to say things that the Financial Times will find disturbing. Okay, fair enough. All right. And now, a surprising jump to religion. The pervasive intolerance of religious belief in certain circles must be resisted, like the Atheist Club or something. The elite's intolerance of religious belief is perhaps one of the most telling signs that its political project constitutes a less open intellectual movement than many within it would claim. Okay, so now we're worried about intellectual openness. We're worried about being too intellectually close-minded, and in particular close-minded about religious belief. I don't know the elite's intolerance of religious belief. Who are the elites that we're talking about? Maybe we're talking about philosophers. Notoriously atheistic demographic. maybe we're talking about academics, like, for American politics, it's almost mandatory until very recently. People would remember in 2016, Bernie Sanders in a debate with Hillary Clinton was asked about his religiosity. And that was typical, right? It was required that you indicate that you're Christian in American politics. So you must not be talking about those kinds of elites. You just say certain circles, and of course it's going to be true. There are some circles where this will be true. But the political project constitutes a less open intellectual movement. So, maybe what we're talking about here is people who claim to have a kind of political liberalism kind of view where tolerance is really important, but you don't tolerate fascists, or you think there should be a separation of church and state, and so you're not actually open. And this must be resisted. Look, probably I would just think that this is throwing a bone to the evangelical crowd. Maybe he's part of it. I don't know. I don't think he is, but I don't know. Some cultures have produced vital advances. Others remain dysfunctional and regressive. All cultures are now equal. Criticism and value judgments are forbidden. Yet this new dogma glosses over the fact that certain cultures, and indeed subcultures, Silicon Valley maybe, have produced wonders. Others have proven middling and worse, regressive and harmful. I'm sorry. I like the idea of being like, Italian culture, mid. He should have said mid. It's merely middling. So, this comes closer to the kind of like ethno-fascist kind of stuff that we've become familiar with. And it's a callback to, very typical colonial era, Eurocentric kind of ideas that European culture is magic and wonderful and has produced everything good and everyone else is awful. I'd like to know who he's talking about, right? Because you might imagine a kind of Christian group targeting on the Muslim world. But of course, the Muslim world was responsible for lots of cultural advances of all sorts. Likewise, if you're thinking of like China as a competitor, you're not going to say that Chinese culture has not produced all kinds of, even adopting the kind of scientific progressy worldview that I've certainly criticized before. So who is he talking about? Is he just trying to trash poor people? Is that the idea here? And relatedly, we must resist the shallow temptation of a vacant and hollow pluralism. We in America, and more broadly the West, have for the past half century resisted defining natural cultures in the name of inclusivity. But inclusion into what? Okay, I actually don't know what this is trying to say. Obviously, he's saying inclusivity bad. That's the sentiment. But if you look at the words, have for the past half century resisted defining national cultures. What does it mean to define a national culture? Okay, so he must be, so he's railing against pluralism here. So I don't know. The best I can think of is like, for example, thinking it's definitional of American culture that it's Christian, right? So this is something that conservatives often say. It's a Christian nation. So there's a correct culture that you have to have. That would be the point of a definition, I would think, right? You would like say this is the correct way to be in this culture, and you could enforce it, something like that. And we've resisted this in the name of inclusivity. Okay, I love the question at the end. Inclusion into what? What are you talking about? Like, are you talking about, do you think it's like the country being included or the culture being included in something? No, we're talking about people. We're talking about including people. We're talking about in a community, are you being inclusive of other people, or are you like, hey, you're a weird outsider? That's not very pleasant. I mean, inclusion into what? That's not, come on, man. Okay, so there you go. You know what? Like, I love a good manifesto. It's not to say I agree with things that are in manifestos, but again, at least they're like, hey, this is what we're about. And they put it in writing. And that's always fun. I don't know if fun's the word here. Again, probably a lot of this would make more sense in the book with some elaboration. It's very hard. This is a very wide-ranging collection of points that they don't all obviously hang together. Obviously, there's certain themes. There's themes about American patriotism and nationalism. I think that's the overriding theme is American nationalism, right? And that is being of the utmost importance. Then you've got part of that nationalism is our products and our services, AI, military stuff, and surveillance, very important. And there's some confusing things about public servants, and there I'm least sure about what they're talking about. In public life, so there should be less criticism of people because then you'll get better leadership or something. And then some cheerleading for Western culture. I think that sort of sums it up. So it's a statement of some goals, a statement of the company's role in this. Anyways, until next time, I'll try to do more things like this and try to produce a little bit on things that are a little bit more topical. Hopefully people find it interesting. See you next time.